Jacob Hartwell desperately needed a schoolmaster for his isolated Montana ranch. But when the stagecoach arrived in 1867, out stepped a mysterious young woman with secrets in her green eyes and knowledge that could transform his daughter's future. As this unexpected teacher begins to heal his family's wounds and awaken feelings he thought died with his wife, a dangerous figure from her past arrives to drag her back east. But will Jacob risk everything to protect the woman who might be his second chance at love? The gunshot echoed across the Montana Valley like thunder, and Jacob Hartwell knew his prize bull was dead before he reached the creek. Blood mixed with the rushing water as he knelt beside the massive animal, his weathered hands finding the bullet wound that told him everything he needed to know. Rustlers had struck again, the third time this month, and now they were killing his livestock just to send a message. "Papa!" 8-year-old Lucy's voice carried panic as she ran through the tall grass, her auburn curls bouncing with each desperate step. Behind her, smoke rose from their cabin's chimney in thick, dark clouds that meant only one thing. Something was burning inside their home. Jacob sprinted toward the cabin, his boots pounding against the hard-packed earth while his heart hammered against his ribs. The September wind of 1867 whipped across the endless Montana territory, carrying the smell of burning wood and something else, something that made his stomach clench with fear. Not again. He couldn't lose another piece of Martha. Inside the cabin, flames licked at the kitchen curtains Martha had sewn with such care 2 summers before the fever took her. Jacob grabbed the water bucket and threw its contents at the fire, steam hissing as the flames died with an angry sizzle. Lucy stood in the doorway, clutching her rag doll against her chest, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged cheeks. "I was trying to make breakfast like Mama used to," she whispered, her voice so small it barely reached his ears. "The bacon caught fire and I didn't know what to do and, shoo, little bird." Jacob pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair while his eyes surveyed the damage. Black soot covered the walls, and the wooden table bore ugly burn marks that would never come out. But they were alive, and that was what mattered. "You're safe. That's all that counts." Yet as he held his daughter, Jacob's mind raced with darker thoughts. Lucy was trying to cook because he'd been out checking cattle instead of making her breakfast. She was attempting grown-up tasks because she had no mother to guide her, no gentle hands to teach her the careful ways of managing a home. The previous teacher had lasted only 3 weeks before declaring ranch life too rough for proper education, and fleeing back to civilization on the next stagecoach. "Papa, will my new teacher really come today?" Lucy asked, stepping back to look up at him with eyes so blue they reminded him painfully of Martha's hopeful gaze. "The stage is supposed to bring someone special, right?" Jacob nodded, though doubt gnawed at his chest like a hungry wolf. He'd written desperate letters to schools across the country, finally receiving word from a placement agency that a qualified instructor would arrive on today's stage. The fee had cost him nearly a month's earnings from selling cattle, but Lucy needed proper schooling. She was too bright, too curious to waste away in this isolated valley without education. "Let's clean up this mess and then ride to town," he said, grabbing a cloth to wipe soot from the table. "Can't have your teacher seeing our home looking like a tornado struck it." As they worked together, scrubbing and straightening, Jacob found himself wondering what kind of person would agree to teach in such a remote location. Probably someone desperate, he figured. Maybe an older man who'd failed at other jobs, or a young fellow fresh from college with romantic ideas about frontier life that would crumble after his first Montana winter. The ride to Clearwater took nearly an hour, their horse picking its way carefully along the winding trail that connected their ranch to the small town. Lucy chattered excitedly about lessons and books, while Jacob's thoughts kept returning to the dead bull and the message it represented. The Bannock gang had been growing bolder, hitting isolated ranches and taking whatever they pleased. A single man with a young daughter made an easy target. Clearwater consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, and a tiny depot where the stagecoach stopped twice weekly. A handful of weathered buildings lined the dusty main street, and chickens pecked at scattered grain near the blacksmith's forge. Jacob tied their horse to the hitching post just as the familiar rumble of wheels and hoofbeats announced the stage's arrival. The driver hauled back on the reins, bringing his team of 6 horses to a snorting, stamping halt in a cloud of dust and jangling harnesses. Jacob stepped forward expectantly, Lucy hiding shyly behind his legs, as she always did around strangers. The door swung open with a rusty creak. But instead of the grizzled schoolmaster Jacob had imagined, out stepped a young woman who took his breath away and turned his world upside down in the space of a heartbeat. She moved like water flowing over stones, smooth, graceful, and completely unexpected in this rough country where women were as rare as spring flowers in winter. Her dark hair was pinned back in a practical style that couldn't quite tame its natural waves, and her green eyes swept across the small crowd with intelligent curiosity rather than the fear or disgust Jacob had seen in other Eastern visitors. "Mr. Hartwell?" Her voice carried education and refinement, but also something stronger, a core of steel wrapped in velvet politeness. "I'm Miss Catherine Brennan." Jacob's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. This couldn't be right. The agency had sent a woman, a young, attractive woman who would set tongues wagging from here to Helena? His neighbors already whispered about his unconventional ways since Martha's death. How he let Lucy run wild. How he kept too many books. How he talked to his daughter like she had a brain instead of treating her like a pretty decoration. "There's been a mistake," he managed, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "I requested a male teacher." Miss Brennan's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained pleasant. "Your letter specified a qualified educator for your daughter's instruction. I graduated from the Boston Female Seminary with highest honors and taught successfully in Philadelphia for 3 years. She paused, and something flickered across her face. A shadow of pain or regret that was gone so quickly Jacob wondered if he'd imagined it. "Circumstances brought me west, Mr. Hartwell. I assure you, my credentials are impeccable." "It's not about credentials," Jacob said, aware that several townspeople had gathered to witness this unexpected entertainment. Old Henrik Larsson leaned against the general store's porch rail, chewing tobacco and grinning at Jacob's obvious discomfort. Sarah Mackenzie clutched her shopping basket tighter, her disapproving frown suggesting she already had plenty to say about this development. "Then what is it about?" Miss Brennan asked, tilting her head with genuine curiosity that somehow made Jacob feel foolish for his objections. Before he could answer, Lucy stepped out from behind his legs. She stared up at the young woman with the frank assessment children used when measuring adults for trustworthiness. Miss Brennan immediately knelt down, bringing herself to Lucy's eye level, a gesture that surprised Jacob with its natural kindness. "You must be Lucy," Miss Brennan said softly. "I've heard wonderful things about you from your father's letters. He wrote that you love stories and numbers equally, which tells me you have a very special mind." Lucy's cheeks flushed with pleasure. No adult had ever called her mind special before. Most people in Clearwater seemed to think little girls should be quiet and helpful. Nothing more. "Can you really teach Latin?" Lucy asked, remembering fragments of conversation she'd overheard between her father and the circuit preacher. "Certainly. Would you like to learn? It's the language of scholars and scientists." Miss Brennan's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Here's your first lesson. Sapere Ode. It means dare to know, or have courage to use your own understanding." "What does that mean exactly?" Lucy pressed, drawn by this woman's obvious intelligence and the way she spoke to her like an equal. "It means being brave enough to ask questions, to learn new things, to think for yourself instead of just accepting what others tell you." Miss Brennan glanced up at Jacob. "It means having the courage to discover who you really are." Something in her tone suggested she spoke from personal experience, and Jacob found himself wondering what had really brought this refined Eastern woman to the rough Montana territory. Women like her didn't typically abandon comfortable lives for the hardships of frontier teaching unless something had gone very wrong in their previous circumstances. "Papa, please?" Lucy looked up at him with pleading eyes that reminded him so powerfully of Martha asking for just one more book, one more chance to expand their daughter's world. "Just for a little while? She knows things I want to learn." Jacob felt trapped between his practical concerns and his desperate wish to see Lucy flourish. Teachers were scarce in Montana territory, especially ones willing to live in isolated ranch country for the modest wages he could afford. Miss Brennan might be unconventional, but she was clearly educated and seemed genuinely interested in Lucy's development. More importantly, Lucy was looking at an adult with excitement for the first time since her last teacher had departed in frustration. The child had withdrawn into herself after that disappointment, spending hours talking to her doll or staring out the window with an expression far too old for her 8 years. 1 month, Jacob heard himself saying, though every instinct screamed warnings about the complications this arrangement would create. We'll try it for 1 month, Miss Brennan. If it doesn't work out, it will work out, she said with quiet confidence that suggested she'd faced doubt before and proven skeptics wrong. I give you my word. As Jacob helped load her single trunk and carpet bag into their wagon, he couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully ordered world was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. Miss Catherine Brennan carried herself like a woman with secrets, and secrets had a way of exploding when you least expected them. But Lucy was already chattering about books and lessons, her face bright with anticipation, and Jacob realized he would endure almost any complication to keep that light shining in his daughter's eyes. What he didn't know was that Catherine Brennan was running from demons that would soon follow her to Montana, bringing danger that would test everything he thought he knew about courage, love, and the price of protecting the people who mattered most. The screaming started at dawn, piercing through the Montana morning like a knife through silence, and Jacob bolted upright in bed knowing something was terribly wrong with his horses. He grabbed his rifle and boots, racing barefoot across the cold wooden floor while the desperate whinnying continued from the direction of the corral. Through his window, he could see dark shapes moving against the pale sky, shapes that shouldn't be there. Catherine appeared in the doorway of the small room he'd prepared for her, fully dressed despite the early hour, her green eyes alert and focused. What's happening? Stay with Lucy, Jacob commanded, then paused as he noticed she held a small derringer in her steady hand. Most Eastern ladies would be fainting or crying by now, but Catherine Brennan stood ready for whatever came next. Where did you get that? Philadelphia isn't always safe for women traveling alone, she said simply. Go. I'll protect Lucy. Outside, Jacob's worst fears proved true. 3 men on horseback were cutting his prize horses from the corral, driving them toward the open range while his stallion, Thunder, reared and fought against the ropes they'd thrown around his neck. The Bannock gang had grown bold indeed, stealing livestock in broad daylight rather than sneaking around in darkness. Let them go, Hartwell, shouted a bearded man Jacob recognized as Pete Bannock himself, the gang's ruthless leader. This is what happens when you don't pay for protection. Jacob raised his rifle, but 3 guns swung toward him faster than lightning. He was outnumbered and outgunned, with his daughter and her teacher depending on his survival. Helpless rage burned in his chest as he watched years of careful breeding and training disappear into the morning mist. Thunder's desperate scream cut through the air as the thieves forced him away from everything he'd ever known. The magnificent stallion had been Martha's wedding gift to Jacob, a symbol of their dreams and hopes for the future. Now he was gone, stolen by men who saw only profit where Jacob saw family. As the dust settled and silence returned to the ranch, Catherine emerged from the cabin with Lucy close beside her. The child's face was pale but determined, her small chin set in a way that reminded Jacob painfully of her mother's stubborn courage. They took Thunder, Lucy whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. They took Mama's horse. Jacob knelt and pulled his daughter close, feeling her small body shake with grief and anger. Over her head, he met Catherine's understanding gaze and saw something unexpected there. Not pity, but the kind of fierce protectiveness he'd only seen in parents defending their young. We'll get him back, Catherine said quietly, and something in her tone made Jacob believe she meant every word. Men like that always make mistakes eventually. Later that morning, as Jacob rode to town to report the theft to the sheriff, Catherine began Lucy's first real lesson. But instead of starting with reading or arithmetic, she spread a large map across the kitchen table and pointed to various locations marked with careful precision. Your father told me you love stories, Catherine began, her finger tracing the winding Missouri River. Well, maps tell the greatest stories of all. They show us where people have been, where they're going, and most importantly, where they might hide when they don't want to be found. Lucy leaned forward, fascinated despite her grief. You mean like the bad men who took thunder? Exactly like them. You see, thieves need certain things: water for their horses, grass for grazing, and places to sell what they've stolen. If we study this map carefully, we can guess where they might go. As Catherine explained the geography of their region, Lucy began to understand that learning wasn't just about memorizing facts from books. Knowledge could be a weapon, a tool for solving real problems and fighting back against people who thought they could take whatever they wanted. Miss Catherine, Lucy said thoughtfully, you know an awful lot about maps and routes for someone who just taught in Philadelphia. Catherine's hand stilled on the map for just a moment. I've always been curious about the wider world, Lucy. Sometimes curiosity leads us to learn unexpected things. But Lucy was 8 years old and sharp as her father's best knife. She'd noticed how Miss Catherine always checked the horizon when she thought no one was looking, how she kept her traveling bag packed and ready near the door, how she'd appeared fully dressed and armed at the first sign of trouble. Are you running away from something? Lucy asked with the brutal honesty of childhood. Catherine met the child's searching gaze without flinching. Sometimes, Lucy, we have to leave one place to find where we truly belong. The important thing is what we do once we find our new home. That afternoon, while Jacob remained in town dealing with the sheriff's endless questions and paperwork, Catherine transformed their small cabin into something magical. She moved furniture to create more space, hung colorful cloth over the windows to soften the harsh light, and arranged her books in inviting displays that made even the most serious subjects seem approachable. But her most surprising addition was a detailed drawing she'd made of thunder, captured with an artist's skill that revealed yet another hidden talent. She'd somehow memorized every line of the stallion's powerful form during their brief morning encounter, creating a portrait so lifelike that Lucy gasped when she saw it. How did you do that? Lucy breathed, touching the paper with gentle fingers. My father was an artist, Catherine explained, then caught herself as if she'd revealed more than intended. I mean, he enjoyed drawing as a hobby. He taught me to really see things, to notice details others might miss. Lucy studied the drawing more carefully and pointed to a small scar on Thunder's left shoulder. You even got his mark from when he caught himself on barbed wire last spring. Papa will be amazed. When Jacob returned home that evening, exhausted and discouraged by the sheriff's obvious lack of interest in pursuing horse thieves, he found his daughter bent over a slate covered with numbers and his new teacher patiently explaining arithmetic using examples that actually mattered to ranch life. If Thunder can run 15 miles in an hour, Catherine was saying, and the thieves have a 6-hour head start, how far could they travel before your father and his neighbors could organize a search party? Lucy worked the problem with intense concentration, her pencil scratching against the slate. 90 miles, but only if they pushed the horses hard. Papa says you can't maintain that pace for long without ruining the animals. Exactly right. So what does that tell us about their likely strategy? Jacob listened from the doorway, marveling at how Catherine had turned mathematics into a tool for understanding their real situation. This wasn't abstract learning from dusty textbooks. This was education that connected directly to Lucy's world and experiences. But what struck him most was the change in his daughter. For the first time since Martha's death, Lucy seemed fully engaged with life again. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity, her questions came rapid fire, and she moved with the confident energy of a child who felt valued and understood. Papa! Lucy jumped up when she noticed him. Look what Miss Catherine taught me. She showed him the drawing of Thunder, and Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The portrait captured not just the stallion's physical beauty, but something deeper, his spirit, his pride, the wild freedom that had made him special. It's perfect, Jacob said softly, then looked up at Catherine with new respect. You're full of surprises, Miss Brennan. We all have hidden depths, Mr. Hartwell, she replied, but her smile held secrets that made him wonder just how deep those hidden depths might go. As they sat down to dinner together, Jacob realized that in just one day, Catherine Brennan had begun to heal wounds he didn't even know were still bleeding. But he also sensed that whatever had brought her to Montana was far from finished with her, and he found himself hoping he'd have the strength to protect both the women who were rapidly becoming essential to his world. The letter arrived with the Wednesday mail, and Catherine's face went white as fresh snow when she recognized the elegant handwriting on the envelope. She stood frozen beside their mailbox, her hands trembling so violently that the other letters scattered to the ground like autumn leaves, while Jacob watched from the porch with growing concern. Catherine. He'd started using her first name without thinking about it, drawn by the intimacy of shared meals and evening conversations. What's wrong? She didn't answer, just stared at the unopened letter as if it contained a deadly snake. Lucy, who'd been helping hang laundry on the line, noticed the sudden tension and moved closer to Jacob's side with the instinctive caution children develop when they sense adult fear. "It's nothing," Catherine said finally, but her voice sounded hollow and unconvincing. "Just correspondence from Philadelphia." Jacob had learned to read people during his years ranching in dangerous territory, and Catherine Brennan was lying. Whatever that letter contained, it wasn't simple correspondence. It was a threat, a demand, or news that could destroy the fragile peace they'd built over the past 3 weeks. Inside the cabin, Catherine sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour, staring at the unopened envelope while Jacob and Lucy pretended to go about their normal activities. But the letter's presence filled the room like smoke, making everyone nervous and distracted. Finally, Catherine broke the seal with hands that still shook slightly. As she read, her face cycled through expressions of fear, anger, and something that looked like resignation. When she finished, she carefully folded the pages and tucked them into her pocket. "I need to tell you both something," she said quietly. "And I need to tell you now before." "Before what?" Jacob asked, settling into the chair across from her while Lucy climbed onto his lap, sensing that adult conversations were about to become serious and possibly frightening. Catherine took a deep breath that seemed to come from her toes. "I wasn't entirely truthful about why I came west. Yes, I am a qualified teacher, and everything I've told you about my education is accurate. But I didn't leave Philadelphia by choice." She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the vast Montana landscape as if drawing strength from its endless horizons. "I was engaged to be married to a man named Richard Whitmore. His family has significant social and political influence in Philadelphia society." Jacob felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Engaged meant promises, contracts, expectations that Eastern society took very seriously. What happened? Richard believed that wives should be decorative and silent. When I expressed opinions about literature or current events, he would correct me. Initially, I thought he was simply traditional in his views. But as our wedding approached, his corrections became increasingly harsh. Catherine's voice grew quieter, and Jacob had to strain to hear her next words. "The final incident occurred at a dinner party. I disagreed with something he said about women's education, and he struck me across the face in front of a dozen guests." Lucy gasped, her small hand flying to her mouth. Even at 8 years old, she understood that men weren't supposed to hit women, especially not men who claimed to love them. "I ended our engagement immediately," Catherine continued. "But the Whitmore family has considerable power and influence. They spread rumors that I was mentally unstable, morally questionable, and completely unsuitable for respectable employment. No school in Philadelphia would hire me after their campaign of destruction." Jacob's hands clenched into fists. He'd dealt with bullies before, but men who used their social position to destroy innocent women were the worst kind of cowards. "So you came west?" "I came west," Catherine confirmed. "I thought if I traveled far enough, worked hard enough, I could build a new life away from their influence." She turned from the window, and Jacob saw fear naked in her green eyes. "But that letter changes everything. Richard's father, Preston Whitmore, is coming here. He'll arrive on Friday's stage." "Coming here? How did he even find you?" "Teachers are registered with territorial education departments. It wouldn't be difficult for a man with his resources to trace my employment." Catherine's voice grew heavy with defeat. "He's bringing legal documents that claim I breached my engagement contract and owe the family substantial compensation for social embarrassment and financial losses." Jacob stood so quickly that Lucy had to scramble to keep from falling. "That's ridiculous. You can't be forced to marry someone who hurt you." "In Philadelphia society, I can," Catherine said bitterly. Preston Whitmore owns judges, politicians, and newspaper editors. He can make life impossible for anyone who defies him. This isn't Philadelphia, Jacob said firmly. This is Montana territory, where a person's word and actions matter more than their family connections. Catherine's smile held no hope. You don't understand the kind of power men like Preston wield. He won't just threaten me, he'll threaten anyone who helps me. Your ranch, Lucy's future, your standing in the community. I won't let my problems destroy your lives. That evening, after Lucy had gone to bed, Jacob found Catherine packing her few belongings by lamplight. Her movements were efficient but mechanical, as if she were forcing herself through motions that broke her heart. You're not running, he said from the doorway. I'm protecting you and Lucy from something you don't fully comprehend, Catherine replied without looking up. Preston Whitmore doesn't make idle threats. If I'm not here when he arrives, perhaps he'll leave you alone. Jacob crossed the room and gently caught her hands, stilling their frantic packing. Catherine, look at me. She raised her eyes reluctantly, and he saw tears threatening to spill over despite her attempts at composure. Do you know what I've learned in my 32 years? Jacob asked softly. Running from problems doesn't make them disappear. It just makes them grow bigger and meaner while you're looking the other way. This is different. No, it's not. I ran from my grief after Martha died, buried myself in ranch work, and pretended that keeping busy would make the pain go away. All it did was make me half alive and turn Lucy into a lonely little girl who had to learn to cook breakfast because her father was too lost in his own sorrow to take proper care of her. Catherine's breath hitched at his raw honesty. You've brought life back to this house, Jacob continued. You've given Lucy hope and dreams and shown her that women can be strong and intelligent and brave. More than that, you've reminded me what it feels like to look forward to tomorrow instead of just surviving today. He cupped her face gently in his calloused hands. I won't let some Eastern bully destroy that. We'll face this Preston Whitmore together, and we'll send him back to Philadelphia with a clear understanding that you're under my protection now. Jacob, you don't know what you're risking. I'm risking everything that matters to me, he said simply, which is exactly why I'm not backing down. Through the thin cabin walls, they could hear Lucy talking quietly to her doll, practicing the Latin phrases Catherine had taught her. The sound of the child's voice, bright with curiosity and confidence, reminded them both of what they were fighting to protect. Catherine closed her eyes and leaned into Jacob's touch, allowing herself a moment of hope before the storm arrived. In 2 days, her past would catch up with her present, and everything she'd begun to build in Montana would be tested by forces that had already proven they would stop at nothing to reclaim what they considered their property. But for tonight, in the warm circle of lamplight with Jacob's steady presence beside her, Catherine Brennan dared to believe that sometimes love could be stronger than fear, and that home wasn't a place you were born but a place where people were willing to fight for your right to stay. The stagecoach arrived 15 minutes early on Friday, and Preston Whitmore stepped down onto Clearwater's dusty Main Street like a king entering his kingdom. His expensive black suit remained perfectly pressed despite the long journey. His silver-headed walking stick gleamed in the afternoon sun, and his cold gray eyes surveyed the small frontier town with obvious disgust and superiority. Jacob watched from the general store's porch, keeping himself positioned where he could observe without being easily spotted. He'd ridden into town alone, leaving Catherine and Lucy safely at the ranch with strict instructions to stay inside no matter what happened. But seeing Preston Whitmore in person made Jacob's blood run cold. This wasn't just a wealthy man throwing his weight around. This was a predator who viewed people as possessions to be collected or destroyed. Pathetic little settlement, Preston muttered to his traveling companion, a thin man in spectacles who carried a leather briefcase like a weapon. How Catherine thought she could hide in this godforsaken wilderness is beyond my understanding. The thin man adjusted his glasses nervously. Perhaps we should approach this diplomatically, Mr. Whitmore. The territorial authorities might not. The territorial authorities will do exactly what I tell them to do, Preston interrupted sharply. I didn't travel halfway across the continent to negotiate with farmers and cattle herders. Jacob's jaw tightened as he listened to Preston dismiss everyone in Clearwater as beneath his notice. These farmers and cattle herders had built their community from nothing, faced down harsh winters and dangerous wildlife, created homes and businesses through sheer determination and mutual support. But to Preston Whitmore, they were simply obstacles to be swept aside. Henrik Larsson emerged from the saloon, took one look at Preston's fancy clothes and arrogant posture, and spat tobacco juice dangerously close to the man's polished boots. "You lost, city boy?" Preston's face flushed with anger. "I'm looking for someone, Catherine Brennan. I understand she's been teaching school somewhere in this area." "Might be she is, might be she ain't," Henrik replied with deliberate slowness. "Depends on who's asking and why they want to know. I'm Preston Whitmore of Philadelphia, and Miss Brennan is my son's fiancée. She's had her little adventure, but it's time for her to return to her proper place in civilized society." Jacob stepped forward before Henrik could respond with something that might make the situation worse. "Mr. Whitmore? I'm Jacob Hartwell. Miss Brennan teaches my daughter." Preston turned, and Jacob felt the full force of the man's calculating gaze. "Ah, Mr. Hartwell, how convenient. I trust you understand that harboring a runaway fiancé creates certain legal complications. I understand that Miss Brennan is a free woman who makes her own choices," Jacob replied evenly. "And I understand that she's been nothing but beneficial to my daughter's education and our community." Preston's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "Mr. Hartwell, you seem like a reasonable man trying to make an honest living in challenging circumstances. It would be unfortunate if those circumstances became even more challenging due to poor judgment regarding the company you keep." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a poison fire. Jacob felt his temper rising but forced himself to remain calm. Getting into a public confrontation with Preston would only give the man ammunition to use against Catherine later. "Miss Brennan has fulfilled her teaching contract admirably," Jacob said carefully. "If she chooses to return east, that's her decision. If she chooses to stay, that's also her decision." "Choice?" Preston repeated, as if the word tasted bitter. "Mr. Hartwell, Catherine Brennan signed a binding engagement contract. She accepted valuable gifts, made public commitments, and then humiliated my family by fleeing like a common criminal. This isn't about choice. It's about honoring legal obligations and social responsibilities." Jacob's hands clenched into fists despite his efforts at self-control. "And if she refuses to honor those obligations?" Preston's expression grew deadly serious. "Then everyone who has aided and abetted her irresponsible behavior will face the consequences. Business licenses can be revoked, land grants can be challenged, social standing can be destroyed. I have considerable influence, Mr. Hartwell, and I'm not afraid to use it." That evening, Jacob returned to the ranch with a heavy heart and news that made Catherine's face go pale. She sat at the kitchen table listening to his account of the confrontation, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned white. "He's staying at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house," Jacob finished. "Says he'll give you until Sunday to pack your things and prepare for the journey back to Philadelphia." "2 days," Catherine whispered. "He's giving me 2 days to surrender everything I've built here." Lucy, who'd been pretending to read while secretly listening to every word, suddenly spoke up. "Miss Catherine, you said sapere aude means having courage to use your own understanding. What does your understanding tell you to do?" Catherine looked at the 8-year-old with surprise and something like pride. Even in this crisis, Lucy was applying the lessons she'd learned, using education as a tool for solving real problems. "My understanding tells me that running away once more won't solve anything," Catherine said slowly. "Preston will simply follow me wherever I go, and his threats will grow worse each time I defy him." "Then we make a stand," Jacob said firmly. "Here, where we have friends and community support." "Jacob, you don't comprehend the resources at his disposal. Preston owns judges, politicians, newspaper editors. He can destroy your reputation, challenge your land rights, make it impossible for you to sell cattle or secure credit for ranch improvements." "Maybe," Jacob admitted, "but this is Montana territory, not Philadelphia. Out here, a man's word and actions count for more than his bank account or social connections." Catherine wanted to believe him, but she'd seen what Preston could do to people who opposed him. Businesses destroyed, careers ruined, families driven into poverty and disgrace. The thought of Jacob and Lucy suffering because of her past mistakes made her stomach twist with guilt and fear. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I haven't told you about Richard." Jacob waited, sensing that whatever came next would be important. "The night I broke our engagement, after he struck me, he said something that's haunted me ever since." Catherine's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He said that if I ever tried to leave him, he'd make sure I could never find work anywhere, never have a family, never know peace or happiness. He said I belonged to him, and he'd spend whatever it took to prove that point." Lucy climbed down from her chair and moved to Catherine's side, slipping her small hand into the teacher's trembling fingers. "You don't belong to anyone, Miss Catherine. Papa says people aren't property." "That's right, little bird," Jacob said, his voice rough with emotion. "And in Montana, we have ways of dealing with men who think they can buy and sell other people's freedom." But even as he spoke the brave words, Jacob wondered if courage and determination would be enough to protect Catherine from an enemy with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. Preston Whitmore had traveled over 1,000 miles to reclaim what he viewed as stolen property, and men like that didn't give up easily. Outside, the Montana wind carried the scent of approaching winter, and Jacob found himself hoping they'd have enough time to prepare for the storm that was coming, both the weather and the human tempest that threatened to destroy everything they'd begun to build together. Saturday morning brought unexpected visitors to the Hartwell ranch, and Catherine's heart nearly stopped when she looked out the kitchen window to see a dozen riders approaching through the morning mist. For a terrifying moment, she thought Preston had hired men to simply take her by force, but then she recognized the lead horseman and felt relief flood through her like warm honey. Sheriff Tom Bradley rode at the front of the group, his weathered face grim but determined. Behind him came Henrik Larson and his two sons, Sarah Mackenzie's husband Bill, young Pete Morrison from the next valley over, and several other ranchers Catherine had met during her weeks in the community. They weren't coming as enemies, they were coming as allies. "Jacob," Sheriff Bradley called out as he dismounted near the porch. "We need to talk." Jacob emerged from the barn where he'd been checking their remaining horses, his expression cautious but hopeful. "Tom, folks, what brings you all out here so early?" "Word travels fast in a small community," Bradley replied, removing his hat and running fingers through his graying hair. "We heard about your visitor from Philadelphia, and we've been doing some thinking." Catherine stepped onto the porch, Lucy close beside her, both of them sensing that this gathering might determine their future in Montana. The assembled men looked at her with respectful nods rather than the suspicion or judgment she'd feared. "Miss Brennan," Sheriff Bradley said formally, "we understand you've got some trouble following you from back east." "Yes, sir," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm afraid my presence here might cause difficulties for good people who don't deserve to be caught in someone else's problems." Henrik Larson spat tobacco juice and shook his head. "Miss, you've been teaching our children, helping our families, contributing to our community. Far as we're concerned, that makes you one of us." "Henrik's right," added Bill Mackenzie. "My Sarah says Lucy's never been happier or more eager to learn. You've done more for our kids in a few weeks than that last teacher did in months." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his expression serious but kind. "Miss Brennan, this Preston Whitmore came to see me yesterday evening. Made some mighty big threats about what would happen if we didn't cooperate with his demands." Catherine's stomach clenched. "What kind of threats?" "Said he'd have federal marshals investigate our town for harboring a fugitive. Claimed he'd contact territorial authorities about improper teaching credentials. Threatened to have our mail service disrupted and our land grants reviewed for irregularities." The assembled men shifted uncomfortably, and Catherine felt her hopes crumble. These were good people with families to protect, businesses to maintain, futures to secure. They couldn't risk everything for someone they'd known only a few weeks. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll pack my things and leave with him tomorrow." "Hold on there, miss," Henrik interrupted sharply. "Nobody said anything about you leaving." Sheriff Bradley grinned, and suddenly Catherine realized this conversation wasn't going where she'd expected. "See, Miss Brennan, Mr. Whitmore made one big mistake when he came threatening folks in my territory." "What mistake?" Jacob asked, moving closer to Catherine's side. "He assumed we're all ignorant frontier farmers who'd be scared by his big city connections," Bradley explained. "But I sent some telegrams yesterday after he left my office. Turns out Preston Whitmore's got his own legal troubles back in Philadelphia." Catherine's eyes widened. "What kind of troubles?" "Seems there's been some questions about his business practices. Railroad contracts that went to the highest bidder rather than the best qualified company. Government land deals that benefited his friends more than the public good. Nothing proven yet, but enough smoke to suggest there might be fire." Bill Mackenzie stepped forward. "Point is, Miss Brennan, a man with his own legal worries might not be in the best position to be making threats about other people's legal situations. Moreover," Sheriff Bradley continued, "I had an interesting conversation with Judge Morrison up in Helena. He's Pete's uncle, and he's got some strong opinions about men who use their wealth and influence to intimidate innocent people." Catherine felt a spark of hope beginning to grow in her chest. "What did the judge say?" "Said if Preston Whitmore wants to pursue legal action against anyone in Montana territory, he's welcome to do so through proper territorial courts. But any attempts to use Eastern influence or threats to circumvent local authority would be viewed very unfavorably." Jacob put his arm around Catherine's shoulders, and she felt strength flow between them like electricity. "What does all this mean?" Sheriff Bradley's grin grew wider. "Means Mr. Whitmore's threats aren't worth the paper they're printed on out here. And it means this community has decided that Catherine Brennan is our teacher, under our protection, and anyone who wants to change that situation can go through proper legal channels or get out of Montana territory." Lucy tugged on Catherine's skirt. "Miss Catherine, does this mean you can stay?" "Aye." Catherine looked around at the circle of determined faces, at Jacob's steady strength beside her, at Lucy's hopeful expression, and felt tears threatening to spill over. "I think it might mean exactly that." Henrik Larson chuckled. "Course, there's still the matter of actually convincing Mr. High and Mighty to accept reality. Some folks need more persuasion than others." "Leave that to us," Sheriff Bradley said confidently. "I'm riding back to town this afternoon to have another conversation with our visitor. This time, he'll be hearing about Montana justice instead of Philadelphia privilege." As the group of supporters prepared to leave, Sarah Mackenzie approached Catherine with a warm smile. "You've given our children hope and knowledge, dear. Now it's time to let us give you something in return. A real home where you're valued and protected." After the riders disappeared back toward town, Catherine sat on the porch steps with Jacob and Lucy, watching the morning sun climb higher over their valley. For the first time since Preston's letter had arrived, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where her past couldn't destroy her future. "Miss Catherine," Lucy said thoughtfully, "what's going to happen when Mr. Whitmore realizes he can't make you go back?" Catherine considered the question seriously. Preston wasn't the type of man who accepted defeat gracefully, and cornered predators often became more dangerous rather than less. But looking at the vast Montana landscape surrounding them, at the strong community that had rallied to support her, at Jacob's unwavering presence beside her, she felt ready to face whatever came next. "I don't know, Lucy," she said honestly, "but I do know that whatever happens, we'll face it together." And for the first time since she'd fled Philadelphia, Catherine Brennan truly believed that together might be strong enough to overcome anything. The explosion shattered the Sunday morning silence like a thunderclap from hell, and Jacob threw himself over Catherine and Lucy as flaming debris rained down from what had been their schoolroom just seconds before. Glass shards glittered in the morning light while smoke poured from the devastated building, carrying the acrid smell of dynamite and burning dreams. "Stay down," Jacob shouted over the ringing in their ears, but Lucy was already scrambling toward the destruction, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "My books! Miss Catherine's books!" she cried, trying to run toward the flames before Jacob caught her around the waist. "All our lessons are burning." Catherine stared at the wreckage in shocked silence, watching months of careful preparation and precious teaching materials disappear in a wall of orange fire. Her throat tightened as she recognized fragments of the globe she'd brought from Philadelphia, the maps they'd studied together, the slate where Lucy had worked her first Latin translations. "This is a message," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "Preston's way of showing what happens when people defy him." Jacob's face went hard as granite. "Henrik! Bill!" He called to the neighbors who were already riding hard toward the ranch, drawn by the explosion's sound. "Did anyone see riders leaving the area?" "3 men heading west toward the hills," Henrik shouted back, his horse dancing nervously in the smoke. "Too far away to identify, but they were moving fast." Sheriff Bradley arrived within minutes, his horse lathered with sweat and his expression grim. He dismounted and walked carefully around the burning building, examining the ground for tracks and evidence while the volunteer fire brigade worked to contain the blaze. "Professional job," he announced after several minutes of investigation. Whoever did this knew exactly how much dynamite to use and where to place it for maximum damage without endangering the main house. Catherine's blood turned to ice water. "You think this was planned?" "Miss Brennan, I had that conversation with Preston Whitmore yesterday like we discussed. He didn't take the news about territorial authority very well. Started making some mighty specific threats about consequences for people who interfere with his business." Jacob's hands clenched into fists. "He threatened to destroy property?" "Not directly. Too smart for that. But he did mention how unfortunate it would be if certain accidents were to befall people who harbored his runaway fiancée." Bradley's expression darkened. "Course, I can't prove he ordered this, but the timing's mighty suspicious." Lucy tugged on Catherine's scorched dress. "Miss Catherine, where will we have school now? How can I learn without books or slates or maps?" The child's practical concern cut through Catherine's shock and grief, reminding her that Preston's attack wasn't just about destroying property. It was about crushing hope, eliminating the future she tried to build with Lucy and Jacob. "We'll find another way," Catherine said firmly, kneeling to meet Lucy's worried gaze. "Learning doesn't require fancy buildings or expensive books. It requires curiosity, determination, and the courage to keep asking questions even when people try to silence you." But even as she spoke the brave words, Catherine felt doubt gnawing at her resolve. How could she continue teaching without materials? How could she justify staying when her presence brought such danger to the people she'd grown to love? That afternoon, as the last of the flames died and the full extent of the damage became clear, an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch. Catherine looked up from salvaging what few books had survived to see a young woman riding toward them, her posture confident despite the obvious exhaustion of long travel. "Catherine Brennan?" the woman called out, dismounting near the smoking ruins. "I'm Margaret Foster, and I've come a very long way to find you." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. Another messenger from Preston? Another threat wrapped in polite words? "I'm sorry," Margaret continued, noticing Catherine's wariness. "I should have introduced myself better. I'm a journalist with the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I've been investigating the Whitmore family's business practices for several months." Jacob stepped protectively closer to Catherine. "What kind of investigation?" Margaret opened her saddlebag and withdrew a leather portfolio filled with documents and photographs. "The kind that involves railroad contracts awarded to unqualified companies, land grants given to friends rather than legitimate settlers, and a pattern of using wealth and influence to silence anyone who questions their methods." She gestured toward the destroyed schoolroom. "When I heard Preston Whitmore had traveled to Montana Territory to retrieve his son's former fiancée, I suspected he might resort to his usual intimidation tactics. This confirms my worst fears." Catherine sank onto the porch steps, overwhelmed by the implications. "You're saying Preston has done this before?" "Miss Brennan, the Whitmore family has been destroying lives for years. They've driven competitors out of business, silenced journalists, intimidated witnesses, and ruined the reputations of anyone who dares oppose them." Margaret's voice carried the passion of someone who'd seen too much injustice. "But they've never been held accountable because their victims were too frightened or too powerless to fight back. What makes you think this time will be different? Jacob asked skeptically. Margaret smiled grimly. Because this time, they've attacked someone in a community that fights back. And because this time, I have evidence that even their bought judges can't ignore. She spread photographs across the porch railing, and Catherine gasped at what she saw. Pictures of damaged buildings, destroyed businesses, families driven from their homes, all bearing the hallmarks of Preston's handiwork. These are all people who crossed the Whitmores in some way, Margaret explained. A newspaper editor who wrote unflattering articles. A businessman who refused to pay protection money. A young woman who broke an engagement to Richard Whitmore 3 years before you did. Catherine's blood ran cold. There was someone before me? Emily Patterson. She's been hiding in Colorado territory ever since, too frightened to use her real name or settle anywhere permanently. But she's agreed to testify if we can guarantee her protection. Jacob studied the photographs with growing anger. This is evidence of a pattern of criminal behavior. Exactly. And with your testimony about the threats and this destruction, plus Emily's account of her similar experiences, we might finally have enough to bring federal charges against the entire Whitmore organization. Lucy, who'd been listening quietly from the doorway, suddenly spoke up. Miss Catherine, remember what you taught me about Sapir Ode? Having courage to seek the truth even when it's scary. Catherine looked at her young student, then at the ruins of their classroom, then at the portfolio of evidence that could finally bring justice to people who thought themselves above the law. The choice seemed clear, but the risks were enormous. If I testify, she said slowly, Preston will unleash everything he has against me, against all of us. If you don't testify, Margaret replied, he'll keep destroying lives until someone finally stops him. The question is, do you want to keep running from this man for the rest of your life? Or do you want to stand up and fight? As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and hope, Catherine realized that her choice wasn't just about Preston Whitmore anymore. It was about what kind of woman she wanted to be, what kind of example she wanted to set for Lucy, and what kind of future she wanted to build with Jacob. The battle for her freedom was about to begin in earnest, and this time, she wouldn't be fighting alone. The federal marshal arrived at dawn on Tuesday, his badge gleaming in the early light as he knocked firmly on the cabin door. Catherine's heart raced as she recognized the sound of official authority. But when Jacob opened the door, the marshal's expression was respectful rather than threatening. Miss Brennan? I'm Marshal David Harrison from the Territorial Office in Helena. I understand you've been having some trouble with harassment and property destruction. Catherine stepped forward, surprised by the marshal's professional courtesy. Yes, sir. But I'm not sure what you can do about it. More than you might think, Harrison replied, removing his hat and settling into the chair Jacob offered. See, I've been corresponding with some federal colleagues back east, and it seems Mr. Preston Whitmore has attracted attention from several law enforcement agencies. He opened his saddlebag and withdrew a thick folder of official documents. The Railroad Commission has been investigating irregularities in contract awards. The Land Office has questions about grant applications that benefited his associates. And the Postal Service has complaints about mail interference designed to silence critics. Jacob leaned forward, his interest sharp. What does this mean for Catherine? It means Mr. Whitmore's legal troubles are much bigger than one broken engagement, Harrison explained. Federal authorities are building a case against him for corruption, intimidation, and abuse of power. Miss Brennan's testimony could be the final piece they need. Catherine felt a mixture of hope and fear. What would testifying involve? A formal statement about the threats, the harassment, and the property destruction. Travel to Denver for a federal hearing. And the courage to face Preston Whitmore in court while he's fighting for his freedom. The marshal's words hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Catherine understood that this was her chance to stop running, to finally turn and face the man who tried to control her life. But she also understood the risks. Preston would fight like a cornered wolf, using every weapon at his disposal. How long do I have to decide? She asked. The hearing is scheduled for next month. But Miss Brennan, I need you to understand something important. Harrison's expression grew serious. If you testify, the federal government will provide protection. But if you refuse, there's not much local law enforcement can do to stop a man with Preston Whitmore's resources. After Marshal Harrison left, Catherine sat on the porch with Jacob and Lucy, watching the morning sun climb over their valley. The decision felt enormous, but she realized it wasn't really a choice at all. It was simply the next step in a journey she'd started the day she'd broken her engagement to Richard. Miss Catherine, Lucy said thoughtfully, if you go to Denver and tell the truth about Mr. Whitmore, will other people be safe from him? I hope so, little bird. That's the whole point of having laws and courts, to protect people from bullies who think they can do whatever they want. Jacob reached over and took Catherine's hand. Whatever you decide, we'll support you. But I think you already know what you need to do. Catherine nodded slowly. I need to stop being afraid and start being brave. That afternoon brought another surprise visitor, but this one made Catherine's heart soar with joy. Emily Patterson stepped down from the stagecoach looking nervous but determined. Her brown hair streaked with premature gray but her eyes bright with purpose. Catherine? I'm Emily. Margaret Foster sent me a telegram saying you'd agreed to testify. Her voice carried the slight tremor of someone who'd lived in fear for too long. I wanted to meet you before the hearing. Catherine embraced the other woman, feeling an instant connection with someone who understood exactly what she'd experienced. I'm so glad you came. It means everything to know I'm not alone in this. They spent the evening sharing their stories, and Catherine was amazed by the similarities. Richard's violence, Preston's threats, the systematic destruction of their reputations and opportunities. But she was also struck by their differences. Emily had spent 3 years hiding, while Catherine had found the courage to build a new life. How did you do it? Emily asked as they sat by the fireplace. How did you stop running? Catherine looked at Jacob, who was helping Lucy with her arithmetic at the kitchen table, and felt her heart swell with certainty. I found something worth fighting for. Not just my own freedom, but a future with people who see my worth instead of my weaknesses. You found love, Emily said softly. I found home, Catherine corrected. Love was just part of the package. The next morning, Margaret Foster arrived with more evidence and a proposal that took Catherine's breath away. The Philadelphia Inquirer wants to publish a series of articles about the Whitmore family's crimes. But they want to use your real name and tell your complete story. Catherine felt the familiar flutter of fear. That would make me a target for every enemy the Whitmores have ever made. It would also make you a hero to every woman who's ever been trapped by an abusive man, Margaret replied. And it would send a message that intimidation and violence have consequences. Jacob stepped closer to Catherine's side. What does your heart tell you? Catherine closed her eyes and thought about the destroyed schoolroom, about Lucy's eager questions, about Emily's years of hiding, about all the other women who might face similar choices in the future. When she opened her eyes, her decision was clear. My heart tells me that silence protects the guilty while punishing the innocent, she said firmly. Publish the articles. Tell the truth. Let people know that Preston Whitmore's reign of terror is ending. That evening, as they prepared for the journey to Denver, Lucy presented Catherine with a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a new slate, purchased with the child's own saved pennies, and a letter written in Lucy's careful handwriting. Dear Miss Catherine, the letter read, Thank you for teaching me that learning means being brave enough to ask hard questions and strong enough to stand up for what's right. I hope when I grow up, I can be as courageous as you are. Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she hugged the child who'd become like a daughter to her. Lucy, you're already braver than you know. And no matter what happens in Denver, you'll always be my finest student. As they prepared to leave Montana Territory for the federal hearing, Catherine realized that she was no longer running from her past. She was running toward her future. The battle with Preston Whitmore would be difficult and dangerous, but she was no longer the frightened woman who'd fled Philadelphia months ago. She was Catherine Brennan, teacher, fighter, and survivor, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The federal courthouse in Denver rose from the dusty street like a stone monument to justice, its tall windows gleaming in the October morning sun as Catherine climbed the steps with trembling legs and steel determination. Behind her walked Jacob, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of reporters, curious onlookers, and legal officials who'd gathered for what newspapers were calling the trial of the decade. "Miss Brennan! Miss Brennan!" Reporters shouted questions from the courthouse steps, their voices creating a chaotic chorus that made Catherine's head spin. "Is it true Preston Whitmore threatened to kill you? Will you marry Mr. Hartwell after the trial? How does it feel to challenge one of Philadelphia's most powerful families?" Jacob's strong hand found her elbow, guiding her through the crowd with protective firmness. "Keep your eyes forward," he murmured. "Don't let them see your fear." But Catherine wasn't feeling fear anymore. She was feeling something much more dangerous. Anger burned in her chest like a forge fire as she thought about all the women Preston Whitmore had terrorized, all the families he'd destroyed, all the dreams he'd crushed simply because he could. Today, that reign of terror would finally face consequences. Inside the courthouse, Catherine's confidence wavered as she saw Preston Whitmore surrounded by a team of expensive lawyers, their black suits and cold expressions making them look like vultures circling wounded prey. Preston himself appeared completely calm, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his expensive clothes immaculate despite the long journey from Philadelphia. When his gray eyes met hers across the crowded courtroom, his smile held such malicious satisfaction that Catherine's stomach clenched with remembered fear. He mouthed two words that made her blood freeze. "You're mine." Federal Judge William Crawford entered with solemn dignity, his weathered face bearing the gravity of someone who'd spent decades weighing justice against power. He surveyed the packed courtroom with sharp eyes that missed nothing, from the nervous reporters scribbling notes to the federal marshals positioned strategically around the room. "This hearing will determine whether sufficient evidence exists to proceed with federal charges against Preston Whitmore and associates for conspiracy, intimidation, destruction of property, and violation of interstate commerce laws," Judge Crawford announced. "We'll hear testimony from witnesses, examine physical evidence, and determine whether justice requires further action." The prosecution's opening statement painted Preston as a criminal mastermind who'd used wealth and influence to escape accountability for years. They described a pattern of destroying anyone who opposed him, using methods ranging from economic pressure to outright violence. Preston's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Cornelius Black, countered by portraying Catherine as an unstable woman who'd invented wild stories to justify breaking a sacred engagement contract. He suggested that all the evidence was coincidental, that Preston was simply a successful businessman being persecuted by jealous competitors and vengeful former employees. "Ladies and gentlemen," Black said smoothly, "we're dealing with a woman who fled her responsibilities, abandoned her commitments, and now seeks to destroy an innocent man's reputation rather than face the consequences of her own actions." Catherine felt sick as the lawyer twisted her story into something ugly and shameful. But then she looked at Jacob, whose steady gaze reminded her why she was here, and at Emily Patterson, whose presence proved she wasn't alone in this fight. The first day of testimony came from federal investigators who'd spent months documenting the Whitmore family's criminal activities. They presented photographs of destroyed buildings, financial records showing suspicious payments, and testimonies from victims who'd been too frightened to speak publicly until now. Agent Robert Collins, a stern man with graying temples, held up a photograph of the exploded schoolroom. This destruction occurred within 48 hours of Preston Whitmore's arrival in Montana Territory, using professional-grade explosives that require specialized knowledge and connections. "Objection," Black interrupted smoothly. "No direct evidence connects my client to this unfortunate accident." "Accident?" Agent Collins raised his eyebrows. "Sir, the explosive charges were placed with military precision to maximize property damage while avoiding human casualties. This was the work of professionals hired for intimidation purposes." As the day progressed, Catherine watched Preston's confident facade begin to crack. His lawyers whispered urgently in his ear, and his hands clenched and unclenched on the table as witness after witness described his pattern of criminal behavior. But the real shock came when Richard Whitmore himself entered the courtroom as a surprise witness for the prosecution. Catherine's former fiancé looked older, thinner, his once handsome face marked by what appeared to be years of guilt and fear. "Your Honor," Richard said in a voice that shook with emotion, I can no longer remain silent while my father destroys innocent lives in my name. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs as Richard described years of witnessing his father's criminal activities, of being forced to participate in schemes that violated everything he'd been taught about honor and decency. Miss Brennan was right to leave me, Richard continued, his eyes fixed on the floor in shame. I was becoming just like him, cruel, controlling, violent. When she broke our engagement, it was the bravest thing anyone had ever done in our family. Preston's face turned purple with rage as his own son testified against him. You ungrateful! He started to shout, but his lawyers quickly silenced him. That evening, in their hotel room, Catherine sat by the window looking out at the Denver streets, while Jacob and Lucy played a quiet game of cards. The day's revelations had left her emotionally drained but oddly hopeful. How do you feel? Jacob asked, settling beside her on the narrow bed. Like I'm watching the curtain pull back on a terrible show, Catherine replied. For years, I thought Preston was all-powerful, untouchable. But seeing him in that courtroom, watching his own son testify against him, he's just a man. A cruel, dangerous man, but still just a man. Lucy looked up from her cards. Miss Catherine, will you have to tell your story tomorrow? Yes, little bird. Tomorrow I tell the truth about everything that happened. Will you be scared? Catherine considered the question seriously. I think I'll be nervous, but I won't be scared anymore. There's a difference between healthy nerves and paralyzing fear. That night, Catherine dreamed of Martha Hartwell, though she'd never met Jacob's first wife. In the dream, Martha sat beside her on the courthouse steps, her kind face bright with approval. You're protecting my family now, Martha said gently. Jacob and Lucy need someone strong enough to stand against people like Preston Whitmore. I'm glad it's you. Catherine woke with tears on her cheeks but courage in her heart. Today, she would tell her story completely and honestly, letting the truth speak for itself. As she prepared for the second day of testimony, Catherine realized that regardless of the hearing's outcome, she'd already won the most important victory. She'd stopped running from her past and started building her future. The woman who walked into that Denver courthouse was no longer the frightened bride who'd fled Philadelphia. She was Catherine Brennan, teacher, survivor, and fighter, ready to face whatever Preston Whitmore could throw at her. The courtroom fell silent as Catherine rose to take the witness stand, her navy blue dress rustling softly in the hushed air while 200 pairs of eyes followed her every movement. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, respectable but not fancy, dignified but not intimidating, wanting the jury to see her as a real person rather than a symbol or stereotype. Judge Crawford's voice was gentle but formal as he administered the oath. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do, Catherine replied, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom despite the nervous tremor in her hands. Prosecutor James Morrison, a tall man with kind eyes and silver hair, approached the witness stand with documents in hand. He'd spent hours preparing Catherine for this moment, helping her organize her testimony to present the clearest possible picture of Preston Whitmore's campaign of terror. Miss Brennan, please tell the court about your relationship with the Whitmore family. Catherine took a deep breath and began her story, starting with her engagement to Richard and the gradual revelation of his controlling nature. She described the dinner party where he'd struck her, the public humiliation that followed, and her desperate decision to flee Philadelphia for a new life in the West. I thought if I traveled far enough, worked hard enough, I could escape the consequences of defying Preston Whitmore, she said, her voice growing stronger as she continued. I was wrong. She detailed Preston's arrival in Montana Territory, his threats against Jacob and the community, and the systematic campaign of intimidation that culminated in the destruction of her schoolroom. The explosion wasn't random vandalism, Catherine explained, looking directly at the jury. It was a message. Preston Whitmore was telling me, and anyone who supported me, that defying him would result in the destruction of everything we'd worked to build. Cornelius Black, Preston's lawyer, rose for cross-examination with the predatory smile of a shark scenting blood. Miss Brennan, isn't it true that you broke a legally binding engagement contract? I ended an engagement to a man who struck me in public, Catherine replied firmly. I wasn't aware that accepting a proposal meant surrendering my right to personal safety. But you accepted expensive gifts, met his family, allowed wedding announcements to be published. Surely you understood the social and financial obligations involved. Catherine felt her temper rising but kept her voice level. Mr. Black, I understood that engagement meant two people choosing to build a life together based on mutual respect and affection. I didn't understand it meant becoming someone's property to be controlled and punished at will. Black pressed harder, trying to paint Catherine as a flighty woman who'd abandoned her responsibilities for romantic adventure. But with each question, Catherine's answers revealed more about the Whitmore family's true nature. Tell me, Miss Brennan, if your story is true, why didn't you seek legal recourse in Philadelphia? Why didn't you report these alleged crimes to proper authorities? Catherine's laugh held no humor. Mr. Black, your client owns judges, politicians, and newspaper editors in Philadelphia. Who exactly was I supposed to report him to? That's a serious accusation. It's a serious truth, Catherine interrupted, her composure finally cracking to reveal the fire beneath. Preston Whitmore has spent years buying influence and silencing victims. The only reason we're in this courtroom today is because he finally targeted someone in a community brave enough to fight back. The courtroom buzzed with excited whispers as Catherine's passion broke through her careful politeness. Judge Crawford called for order, but Catherine wasn't finished. You want to know why I didn't seek legal recourse in Philadelphia? She continued, her voice rising. Because I've seen what happens to people who oppose the Whitmores. Businesses destroyed, reputations ruined, families driven into poverty and exile. I came west not to escape responsibility, but to escape becoming another casualty in Preston Whitmore's war against anyone who dares say no to him. When Catherine stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom remained silent for a long moment. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. The applause spread slowly through the gallery as ordinary citizens showed their support for a woman who'd found the courage to speak truth to power. Preston's face was dark with rage, but his lawyers kept him firmly seated as Emily Patterson took the stand. Emily's testimony corroborated Catherine's story in chilling detail, describing her own experience with Richard's violence and Preston's subsequent campaign of destruction. He made sure I could never work again, Emily said quietly. Never feel safe, never trust anyone, never believe I deserved better treatment. For 3 years, I've lived like a ghost, afraid to use my real name or form meaningful relationships because I knew he was still out there, still dangerous. The prosecution's final witness was Sheriff Tom Bradley, who testified about the explosion's aftermath and the community's response to Preston's threats. His weathered face and straightforward manner lent credibility to the prosecution's case. Folks in Montana Territory don't take kindly to bullies, Bradley said simply. We've seen what happens when good people stand together against those who think wealth makes them above the law. As the hearing moved toward closing arguments, Catherine felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. Regardless of the outcome, she'd told her truth completely and honestly. She'd stood up to the man who'd terrorized her and countless others, and she'd done it surrounded by people who cared about justice more than influence. Jacob reached over and squeezed her hand as Prosecutor Morrison delivered his final statement. Ladies and gentlemen, this case isn't just about Catherine Brennan or Emily Patterson or any individual victim. It's about whether we live in a country where wealth and influence place someone above the law, or whether justice applies equally to all citizens regardless of their social standing. Cornelius Black's closing argument painted Preston as a victim of vindictive former employees and unstable women seeking revenge for imagined slights. But his words felt hollow after the mountain of evidence presented against his client. Judge Crawford adjourned the hearing to consider the evidence, announcing that he would render his decision the following morning. As the courtroom emptied, Catherine noticed Preston staring at her with undisguised hatred. "This isn't over," he mouthed silently. But Catherine no longer felt afraid of his threats. Whatever happened next, she'd proven to herself and the world that Catherine Brennan was nobody's victim, nobody's property, and nobody's broken dream. She was a woman who'd found her strength, her community, and her voice. and no amount of wealth or influence could take those things away from her now.